Welcome to our podcast and video cast. I'm Silky Carlo from Big Brother Watch, and for those of you who don't know, Big Brother Watch is a UK civil liberties organisation working to protect privacy, protect freedom of expression, and all of our rights in this extraordinary time, in particular during the coronavirus pandemic. And in this episode, we're going to focus on the impact of the pandemic on freedom of expression. And I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Lesh and Rachel Jolly. And Matthew, could you introduce yourself and tell us about ASI?
Sure. So my name's Matthew Lesh. I'm the head of research at the Adam Smith Institute. We are a free market neoliberal think tank. So we explore ideas that we hope bring society more freedom and more prosperity.
Thanks. And Rachel?
So I'm Rachel Jolly. I'm the editor-in-chief of Index on Censorship. We are a small global organisation. We work across the world and we look particularly at freedom of expression and censorship issues. We are a publisher and campaigner on specific issues. So we publish a quarterly magazine, and currently we're working on a mapping project looking at attacks on media freedom during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Incredible, it's such important work. And we've been so grateful to work with both the Adam Smith Institute and Index on Censorship, as well as other groups in relation to freedom of expression and coronavirus. We sent some letters to social media companies, which you can find on the emergency powers page on bigbrotherwatch.org.uk. Which I'm just looking for now. Here they are, because we sent letters to Facebook, WhatsApp, YouTube, and Twitter. And this is really where I want to start off. There has been, I think we would agree, relatively little public discussion on freedom of expression in particular and how it's being impacted in the current circumstances, despite huge amounts of discussion about the other areas where rights are being impacted. And each of the organisations has very rapidly changed their rules to further limit certain posts in relation to coronavirus. And I think a lot of that is well intended, and it's intended to bat out misinformation and information that might harm people ultimately. It's this terminology of harm that's resurfacing, is one that our groups have grappled with, because the government has been trying to legislate around quote unquote harmful communications online without actually defining what harmful means. And so I thought it would be a good starting point for us to try to explain to people how the rules have changed and what that means. So if we look at, maybe we should start with Twitter. And I'm just going to start with a couple of points about Twitter's new policies, and please jump in for things that I miss. But the new Twitter policy effectively says that information on the platforms which deny the advice of local health authorities, or could influence people to go against the advice of local health authorities, or that could cause social unrest. These are just a few examples of the kind of information that is now going to be banned and need to be removed on Twitter. Rachel, what's your thoughts about this new policy?
I think our concern, and it relates to what's happening with other companies, is around overreaction, temporary nature of such policies, and also how the social media companies are being put under a lot of pressure from governments to take a more draconian position. So, and also by parts of the public. So I'm sure they feel like they're being pushed and pulled in different ways. But it's very typical of a period of, of a crisis period where governments try and reduce what people are allowed to say. And, I suppose the obvious parallel is wartime, isn't it? So we are constantly calling for changes to be proportional, to be well thought out, and to be temporary. That, if changes are brought in, let's look at these as periods of exceptional times, and take account of the fact that these shouldn't be put into place for the long term.
And I mean, even during this period now, some of those policies, the policies that require, they appear to require adherence to local health authorities, even global health authorities, at a time when people's lives and liberties are at stake. And it seems to me that there's something distinctly political about that, because there's no kind of scientific determinism behind how precisely what kind of advice public should be given. And as we've seen in the UK, I know there are protests that have already been attempted, protests that are planned, whether in relation to coronavirus or other things. There have been protests in Germany and in other countries. Matthew, are you worried about how the policies might impact people's ability to protest?
Look, I'm worried about it in terms of people's ability to protest, but I think there's a broader story going on here, which is we don't have a lot of discussion about free speech issues during this crisis. It's not necessarily something at the forefront, and that's kind of the opportunity where these kind of authoritarian actions get taken in the silence of it all. We're seeing our governments putting pressure, I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit more, onto social media companies to remove this content. Now, I think this is following some very interesting and the usual kind of characteristics of censorship, which is we're not quite clear what is lawful and what is unlawful speech. And this is part of the issue with even the government's broader agenda about online harms, which is quite a dangerous agenda because anything can be theoretically defined as harmful. And once you define it so broadly, it becomes quite problematic. So therefore, these social media companies have to depend on an authority source, some kind of scientific truth body. Now, that's often in this crisis, the companies are choosing the World Health Organization. Now, the WHO is a great organization in many respects, but doesn't have a particularly good track record during this crisis when it comes to necessarily knowing what is going on in the world. I mean, this is the same organization that in January informed us that local transmission and human-to-human transmission was very unlikely. This is the organization which has consistently advised against mask wearing, despite many governments, including now the UK government, advising in favor of mask coverings. This is the same organization that refuses to acknowledge the existence of Taiwan, that says China's authoritarianism is a model for the world to follow. As well as, this kind of broader sense of uncertainty about the virus itself. There's a lot we still don't know. It does look like the virus started in the Wuhan wet markets, but we don't know that with any certainty. And there is definitely some questions about what research is going on in the Wuhan labs. Now, these are complex questions that no authority figure necessarily has a certain answer to. And if they do have an answer to, those answers often change. Just in the last few days on masks, the UK government's position has changed. Public Health England are now recommending wearing of face coverings because they do believe there is some benefit there. So the problem with social media companies more fundamentally with deciding that what they're no longer going to try to focus on censoring is, let's say, offensive or harmful speech when it impacts kind of an individual. But even now they're extending that concept to trying to censor specific ideas, not just something that offends me as an individual or is racist, sexist, or homophobic or whatever else, but is very much focused on trying to remove disinformation more or less, or things they perceive to be disinformation. It creates really terrible precedents for online speech censorship, and I worry that they're not going to go away when this crisis is over. Now that social media companies have decided that they're in the truth business and that they're going to use authority figures to define what is that so-called truth, when we all know the truth is often contested, it's just going to keep getting worse and worse. And I think it's quite a frightening world we're now entering into when it comes to online censorship.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
I was just going to pick up on Matthew's point about the definition of harm. I mean, if we want to look at international examples, look what's happening in places like Hungary and Serbia, where journalists are being told that they're not allowed to cover stories. So you've got a situation where a Serbian journalist was arrested for covering a story about a hospital not having enough PPE. because she quoted unofficial sources. Now, that story turned out to be very valid and very important. And of course, the public should know about that. But, when the government or when any government starts defining things very loosely like this, it can be very dangerous and, and cover up things that the public really should know.
Yeah, and of course, then the questions become for social media companies, which governments are you basing what you censor on? Are you choosing to follow Serbia's declarations, or Brazil's, or Turkey's, or Russia's, or the US's, or the UK's? There's no single, internationally approved sense of truth in this crisis. So when the social media companies start deciding that they're going to use authority figures, there becomes fundamental questions about which authority figures they're using, and then that speaks to this broader issue of free speech. Is when you start censoring speech that is disliked by authorities, you end up very much stopping the kind of debate that we expect in a free society.
That's precisely my concern. And my concern is that the way in which the social media companies are now aligning their policies with local authorities in an area where facts and decisions and policies and guidance are constantly changing is basically for the platforms to be aligning themselves with the authorities, almost like an extra, government agency. There are things that we can say in the UK and things that we can't say in the UK on Twitter that presumably would be completely fine to say in Sweden because they've taken a completely different approach. Both governments will claim that the approach is just merely following the science, but of course there's really no such thing. All of the decisions are political, and that's why they require free and open debate. And it does seem that I understand, I think, Matthew, what you were getting at about the need for the social media companies need to look to an external authority. And in this case, it's becoming more and more centralized. So now they're looking to a global authority. They're looking to the World Health Organization, which is not, as you alluded to, not an entirely apolitical body. And it's almost like searching for a kind of godlike figure in a time of panic, that there's this one central body that must have all of the answers. And as you've pointed out, that sometimes they change and they don't. But what I really feel is, and this is, it's I'm bloody exhausted to keep rehearsing the same arguments about freedom of expression and where the limits actually lie. But of course, normally you just look to the law. What does the law say about what we can and can't say? Because these are long established principles that protect people, and they've been made under human rights law. They're compatible with human rights law. But what we're seeing is a real willingness and lots of people, and I have to say a lot of rights groups as well, turning a blind eye to the fact that now lots of information is being censored that's lawful speech. And with these new policies, the social media companies are directly aiming at lawful speech. That's quite chilling, isn't it?
Yeah, we've seen all sorts of, we've seen examples already of vital information being taken down, which is really worrying, but is just probably a sign of what could happen. And so you don't want to be handing over that decision to basically machines. As we know, a lot of these decisions will be made by AI, and the decision-making process will not be very robust and can go wrong in all sorts of ways. So there's lots of reasons why this can be very, very difficult and very dangerous.
What's the worst examples of that either of you have seen of information that should have been available on social media platforms being taken down under these new policies?
I think early on in the crisis, Facebook, and I think they've acknowledged this, started removing swathes of content using their automated system. I think it was partly because as the lockdown began, they had fewer moderators, and therefore they turned up the dial on misinformation in their machine learning or AI-based systems. And it turns out those systems are heavily imperfect. So they were deleting or hiding a lot of posts with, legitimate, completely, almost universally accepted public health information. We've seen Facebook ban mask advertisements, I believe, during the crisis, which is obviously quite questionable. At the same time, I think this just feeds into this trap that the social media companies have now walked themselves into. In fairness, this started long before the crisis, which is that they've decided that, as you were saying, that they're no longer going to just try to deal with illicit content, but they can also try to deal with a whole bunch of other things as well. And there's no point at which you stop when you decide that you are speech censors in order to create a platform of some description. So I think as private companies, they're perfectly entitled to decide what isn't on their platform. But I think they've set themselves up for a lot of demands from government to remove content once they start accepting that they're going to remove legal speech, but that is harmful. And then they've set themselves also up, and in many cases being willing to accept new regulatory regimes they're on the way from governments, because more or less they're just kind of doing it themselves anyway. So it's eventually going to have some kind of state authority behind the content they remove, and then effectively the limits of speech have been substantially narrowed when this is all done. Because the social media companies will in some way be legally mandated to remove things that are in their policies, potentially under the online harms framework the UK government's proposing. So we're walking into a very dangerous situation here where speech, which might in the short run, people could say, there is some terrible conspiracy theories about 5G causing COVID-19. We need to really deal with those. And that kind of thing is used as an excuse. But I don't think the implications of this are very well thought through in terms of what governments are asking social media companies to do, and quite frankly, what we don't even know the governments are asking social media companies to do, both democratic and undemocratic companies.
Yeah, I completely agree. And let's talk about government's role in this, because these decisions, as I understand it, have not been made by the social media companies purely off their own backs, but they are coming under significant pressure from governments. We have just a UK focus, so I can only really talk about what's going on here. But we know simply from a government press release that a rapid response unit has been set up, and a similar thing was set up before by number 10 of the Cabinet Office. This time this unit operates specifically in relation to what they call harmful online narratives around coronavirus, and it's working with another unit called the Counter Disinformation Cell. There's very little public information about these units and cells and precisely what they're doing, but what they say, at least they're doing in their press releases, is basically pressuring social media companies to take down what they call harmful content, which is to completely swerve the routes by which a public authority should go down to go through the appropriate tests in law to ascertain whether something is someone has the right to say something or not. And that's what we're really talking about. If we accept that these companies, they're not publishers, so it's easy to pitch government against big tech, but really this is government against individuals, because we are supposed to be able to more or less post freely on these platforms. Rachel, do you know anything more about these government cells and units popping up? Again, if you look at I just wanted to say, I wanted just to go somewhere else first, and I'll come back to that. But I think we should acknowledge that this is all happening in an extreme climate with various other actions going on around it. So we're seeing press conferences where government ministers don't want to take questions. Obviously, that seems to be a global trend right now, where ministers or national leaders just would prefer that no questions were asked that are critical in any way. I mean, obviously this week we've seen Trump walk out of a press conference because he didn't like the question that the journalist was asking. And if you're looking for more context of where this can sort of end up, in Malaysia, a journalist has been charged over some post she made to her Facebook account, warning about the arrival of a cruise ship after the outbreak. And she's been charged under the Malaysian Penal Code, which is, quote, statements conducting to public mischief. And, ultimately she could end up, or she faces up to 6 years in prison under this charge, and all of this is adding up to a global crisis of expression, I think, where
our rights to speak and raise criticism, argue, are being pressed by all sorts of methods in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. In the UK's case, it's a little more subtle, which is, as Silky was saying, we have the government developing these kind of Orwellian sounding, rapid response units and disinformation units. We should always remember that state diktats act in a similar way to actual laws and regulation, albeit without any kind of democratic accountability. The implicit threat when the government starts ordering businesses around is that that will be followed very closely by actual regulation and actual laws and punishment if they do not comply. In this case, we've already got the online harms regime on the table. And I think the companies, and this is why I'm a little bit sympathetic to the companies, they know if they don't do what they're told now, then they could expect in the future, in this forthcoming regime, the likes of fines or jail time for their executives. So right now, they feel like they have to prove their censorship and prove their willingness to work with the government in order to avoid an even more censorious future. And I really am just extremely disappointed that this can all go on in a country like the United Kingdom, a country with a history of people fighting for rights and liberties without any kind of real accountability or any real questioning about what these units are doing in these interactions. I mean, if the government's going to ask the social media companies to do something on our behalf, they should at the very least tell us what they're asking. We're told that they're dealing with dozens of pieces of misinformation every week. What are those dozens of pieces of misinformation? If they want to combat misinformation, they should do it in the public, not in private, and through encouragement, not through force.
I completely agree. But and by the way, we have the three of us and I think one other organisation, Open Rights Group. We have sent a letter to the relevant government department asking for more clarity about this and asking precisely what that information is and how these units are operating, and also can they engage with us so that we can have that transparency and see exactly what's going on and maybe give some advice. But
I think we should acknowledge that this is really not being debated in Parliament. It's not getting the light of parliamentary scrutiny. So a lot of these kind of things are just happening without other MPs, the opposition parties, etc., being allowed to input into these decisions.
If anything, the opposite. In fact, there have been certain MPs in Parliament pushing on the social media companies and questioning, the lack of willingness to remove content. So the conspiracy goes even further than just the government, but into Parliament at times. And you're right, there doesn't seem to be much opposition to it. I think it's genuinely hard for politicians to stick out their neck during a time of crisis to say, even crazy ideas should be able to be expressed, even ones that are, quote unquote dangerous. I mean, the real danger of this information isn't particularly ever well justified. It's just assumed that putting out this information or people expressing certain ideas is dangerous. And I think that comes from a fundamentally flawed conceptualization of humans. This is basically the idea that if somebody hears a crazy idea online, then they're suddenly going to be persuaded by it. In fact, when you try to censor these ideas, it has that precise effect sometimes. It's not like when you remove David Icke's YouTube channel as now is being done by Google, that his ideas suddenly disappear. Conspiracy theorists really enjoy being censored because it provides justification or legitimacy that the ideas they're expressing are in some ways naughty or have some truth to them that the governments want to hide. So I don't think the government's thinking through very well, what is the first principle here? What are we trying to achieve here? What is the implications of trying to censor speech? Or is there really any justification to start censoring the speech in the first place, especially considering the fact that it is ultimately legal speech? You may, and I absolutely do, find this person like David Icke absolutely gross and disgusting. That doesn't mean that he shouldn't be able to express his ideas just like anyone else in a civilized, free society.
Well, I think the discussion of his ideas also is a way of discrediting them, right?
Of course.
If they're completely stupid, which they often are, then actually it's worth people realizing that rather than thinking that it's something exciting that they don't, they're not allowed to hear about.
Sunshine is the best disinfectant.
Absolutely. And And I think where people become more alarmed, especially if they're attracted to discredited ideas that are disseminated, that people then become rightfully alarmed that there is this accumulation of power from governments and big tech companies in then doing precisely this kind of censorship, which seems to benefit no one. But coming back to the point about the lack of discussion and alarm that there's been about this, and this is why I'm so glad to be having this conversation with you guys now, and glad that we've sent the letters that we've done, and hopefully we'll take further action. But can we just discuss the fact that the online censorship has not been very widely discussed by lots of rights groups and NGOs. And the people who are being censored have been left adrift somewhat. And all of the political conversation in this space, in Parliament, and also amongst many civil society groups, tends to be around misinformation. And it always seems that anyone who's tasked with talking about freedom of expression is more likely to talk about misinformation and the scourge of disinformation and getting rid of it and all the rest of it, than they are about the dangers of censorship. Why is that?
It almost feels like freedom of expression as a concept has sort of fallen out of favor in some way, doesn't it? Where people are just don't engage with it as an idea. I do find that's different in countries where, in living memory, people have experiences, say, living under a dictatorship. So if you have, you happen to be talking to Spanish people who remember what it was like living under Franco, or Germans who remember what it was like with the Stasi, that kind of living memory really makes a difference to people's commitment to the idea and the concept and why it's important. But I feel like oftentimes in countries which haven't got that kind of immediate, massive experience of something as dreadful as that, people are willing to put aside their rights and freedoms much more easily.
Yeah, I think there's some specific, even shorter term, or I should say short to medium term by now, reasons for this. And I think it's more or less what we've seen around the likes of Donald Trump's election and Brexit, which is that a certain class of human rights activists have been so viciously opposed to both of those democratic results. They have come to the conclusion, and this is very much the popular media narrative in this field, that the only reason why Donald Trump was elected or that Brexit happened was because people were misinformed, and therefore we must deal with this fake news and misinformation. And it's actually quite a condescending idea to begin with, that people were tricked into voting for this. And you might think that they were tricked into voting for this, but just the idea that what we need to do is just hide information from people and then they'll vote politically the way we want them to vote, is just absolute and complete and total nonsense. You need to win in the contest of ideas if you're going to win people's support at elections and referendums and whatever else. And if you're not willing to do that, I think it's quite lazy and quite a lazy way to operate, to then focus on this disinformation and fake news agenda, which I think is really very much derived as a response to populism and those populist moves, but in fact probably actually ultimately is just going to further populism, as you were getting hinting at earlier, Silky. The people who are going to benefit in a situation where we're undermining institutions because those institutions are seeking to censor people's ideas are going to be the weirdos and the whack jobs who are going to present the most crazy extreme alternatives, aren't going to be doing that on the mainstream social media sites. They're going to do that in much darker parts of the internet, or they're going to do that in rallies in public, where it's still, of course, legal to do so and not restricted, without anyone actually contesting them, without anyone presenting ideas. And then they'll use the fact that they're being censored online as part of their political narrative, that authorities and these international tech companies, which are left-wing or whatever, are coming after them and censoring them. So in many ways, I think it's quite counterproductive kind of activity that's being done, because people have a perception of basically that it's right to try to limit information.
I think also, and just to add a small point on that, is there has been a really destructive idea that by being on a panel with someone whose views might be, racist or sexist or in some other way offensive to some other people, that somehow you condone their ideas. So the idea of just being on a panel with somebody becomes something that lots of people are like, I can't be on a panel with X because I disagree with their views, as if that by somehow being on the panel and debating with them is a bad thing, that you're somehow validating their views. And I think that's such a dangerous idea because, you see it often in politics. With Sadiq Khan during the mayoral election, I noticed that he was being accused of being on panels with people, and somehow he was therefore tainted by their ideas. So, so often you hear this being held up as, isn't it terrible that person was seen on the panel with such and such. We seem to have lost the idea that, you can engage in debate with people without agreeing with them. In fact, you can viciously, dangerously, you can disagree with them strongly. But, and in fact, wouldn't that be better as a way of engaging with those ideas? But I don't know why we've lost this idea that somehow being in a room with someone that you disagree with is somehow a terrifying idea.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like the most responsible thing that you can do in response to information that's not factual or is going to have some kind of negative effect is to engage with it, and to engage respectfully with the people who put it out as well. But this is a completely unaccepted idea right now, particularly in the context of the pandemic. But I completely agree with both of your analyses that we're suffering from both complacency about our right to freedom of expression on the one hand, and also a panic about misinformation and disinformation, and this as quite anti-populist view that you can that kind of suggests there's contagion with information, and also with speakers or people that put out information. So if an ordinary person goes online and they see something that says 5G is going to give you coronavirus or something, that they are then tainted and they have caught that information virus, and it's going to have a bad effect.
We see this all the time with metrics about how much disinformation posts someone see. It's never actually put in any kind of proportion. We all see thousands of posts every day. That doesn't mean we're suddenly persuaded by it. Or the old joke is I learnt about Germany invading Poland in 1939. That doesn't mean I'm about to go fight in the war or something for the Reich. I mean, just learning about information or doesn't necessarily spur action, especially if you can counter that information successfully in public debate or explain why that is not particularly true or not a particularly good idea.
This brings me perfectly to something that happened early this week with Michael Gove's bookshelf. So he had a David Irving book on his bookshelf, who's a notorious Holocaust denier. And this is one of the most difficult areas of freedom of expression. But I thought what was really interesting was that so many people came out in Michael Gove's defense, pointing out the fact that he had contested Holocaust denial and some of Irving's pretty gross ideas, and defending the idea that you can have whatever you want on your bookshelf, and that having something on your bookshelf doesn't necessarily mean that you adhere to all of the ideas that are in that book, and we shouldn't be policing other people's bookshelves. I wonder what you guys think about that. I mean, personally, I was absolutely stunned by the amount of people who, and even policymakers, who are actively pushing the online harms censorship, and the idea that if you even see fleeting information online, let alone buy it, keep it in your house on public display, but just by seeing information online, that you therefore will, it has a dangerous impact on you, and so it has to be censored and it shouldn't be allowed. And of Facebook's new policy of giving people a little tap on the shoulder as well, if you've engaged with any of this prohibited coronavirus content, you're going to get a notification giving you some World Health Organization information to kind of correct your bad views.
Re-education camps are next. Yeah.
Facebook's re-education efforts. Did you detect any, have I read this wrong, or did you detect any contradiction in this vehement defense of Michael Gove's bookshelf compared to pro-online censorship?
Well, I was quite pleased to see some people coming out and saying, you know, frankly, Michael Gove can read what he wants, or whoever can read what they want, because actually I think we should have more of those discussions and actually saying, yeah, actually it's really good to read a variety of views, and you just not just read the things that you already agree with. Of course, you know, I would say that, but I was really happy to see at least some people having that debate, which is, you know, is much needed. However, there was a lot of people, as you say, saying the opposite, and it is extremely worrying, isn't it, when you see people kind of condemning people for reading a book. I mean, really, is that really where you want to put yourself? So you're suggesting that gaining knowledge is a bad thing. I mean, how could you even potentially criticize somebody's thinking if you don't know what it is? I mean, the whole idea of banning people from reading books because you disagree with the views in the book, I mean, it's just stupidity gone mad, isn't it?
It was absolutely crazy, kind of 24 hours on Twitter. It's quite clearly obvious to a lot of people that you are allowed to own books with which you disagree. It is worth noting that the particular book that Michael Gove owned was basically his the German side's view of the rise of Hitler, or the Nazi side's view of the rise of Hitler, and that in itself is a historical document. If you're going to have a good understanding of the pre-war period, you should probably read as widely and broadly on that as possible. What though I felt in particular, just going back to the genesis of your question, talking about why did we see this relatively high defense of free speech, I think it probably in some quarters just felt like a return of the traditional kind of culture war debates. I mean, for so long during Corona, we're in this weird universe with this completely different national discussion that doesn't seem to as necessarily well fit into the usual confines of, you know, left, right, or Brexit, Remain, I thought, or whatever else it may be. I felt like this very much activated a lot of the kind of culture war stuff that can sometimes go on. So, you know, you had Owen Jones saying, you know, those terrible fascist Tories, and then you had Tories going, no, free speech, you know, their right to say it. It felt like it was a bit of a return in those periods for everyone's usual debating sides in these kind of arguments.
Yeah, I'm almost missing those days and simpler times.
Yeah.
Since we've been talking about the role of the World Health Organization in some of this censorship, I just wanted to quickly flag a relatively new development, which is a partnership between the World Health Organization, the UK government, and the BBC. Matthew, I think you've had a look at this. Can you just explain a little bit more about this?
Sure. So it doesn't seem to be a lot of information as of yet. There was of course, there was a media release put out by the World Health Organization saying that they're working with UK government and Number 10 in collaboration with the BBC World Service and World News in order to put out correct information about coronavirus from either check your local authorities or check the WHO. And again, I think this just speaks to this broader challenge we now face, which is the dependence on authority figures during a time of crisis, and not necessarily that those authority figures are informing us correctly, but instead trying to close up what is acceptable in terms of debate. As a fundamental principle, I think it's worth remembering that a virus cannot hear what we say. We may be, quote unquote, at war with this disease, but this is not like a war where secrecy is a virtue, where we need to hide information from the enemy soldiers because they might, know our strategy of attack. In fact, the opposite is true here. We need to shine a light on ideas in order to combat this virus. And we haven't said it yet, but we can't forget that this virus ultimately began in a place that is heavily censored. It began with the Chinese government censoring whistleblowers who were trying to raise alarm about this virus. People say, free speech, very theoretical concept, Matthew, it doesn't really matter too much. Well, free speech in this case has had life and death consequences. When we censor ideas, we can no longer have the debates we need to have. We can no longer have access to the information we need to have in order to defend ourselves and defend society. And if only China was a free society, if only those doctors were able to warn the world about this forthcoming virus in late December, to the point where we knew to start screening passengers coming in from China. We knew that potentially we needed to prepare for this virus by ordering PPE and protecting care homes and whatever else. We'd lost that crucial time. Millions of people left Wuhan and left China, and this virus spread across the world precisely because the ideas were censored.
And there are life and death decisions being made now with the policies that our government and other governments are making, that therefore, you know, they're highly political decisions, and decisions that we should all have a say on. And I think, bringing us back full circle, the worrying thing about these kinds of partnerships between broadcasters, World Health Organization, and the government, having the government's hand in what people are able and are not able to say or report, at a time when they're asking for extraordinary adherence to major restrictions that have an impact on our lives, on people's ability to seek healthcare, on people's mental health and well-being, and all sorts of other things. It's worrying. And in particular, it's worrying. This has even been said quite explicitly by YouTube and Facebook, and it's certainly clear in Twitter's rules, is that if people try to organize protests in these circumstances, we probably won't be allowed. That's probably going to be banned content. And that is an absolutely, really, I think, terrifying place for the social media companies to put themselves, you know. And it's just frankly absurd as well, the idea that we can go to garden centers, you can go and work on a construction site, you can go and play golf, but you can't express dissent against your own government, and you can't use social media platforms to do that. That just can't be right.
I think anything that is going to restrict journalists from reporting accurately in this period is very worrying. And we need journalists to be holding the government in this country to account, but governments in every country to account in this period. And it really is a time where there should be the strongest bits of investigative journalism and the best kind of reporting. So I think we have seen some of that, and I'm glad to see that. But you know, we have to be really wary of media freedom being restricted in a variety of ways.
And to finish on that really important point, Rachel, what do you think about the health of the UK media at the moment, and the kind of position that they're in to be telling the stories and giving us the information that we need in the UK right now?
I think it's actually quite a scary moment for the media. I mean, I know lots of journalists who are on furlough because their companies can't afford to keep paying them. Obviously, we've seen a massive downturn in advertising, which is really important for keeping media companies going, whether that's television or newspapers. So, of course, the number of journalists actually working has gone down dramatically during this period, you know, both at local level and national level. And we should be really worried about how much local news reporting we're getting right now, because I think we really need that information to be there for us right now. And everybody, I think, is looking to find out information for what's going on in their locality, what's allowed, what's open, you know, on really basic things like where they can find food. And if that kind of journalism is not there, will it ever recover? And that's not just in the UK, but in other countries as well. So the media model and the finance for that model is really threatened by this. And that's very worrying. On the other hand, I think we have seen some really strong pieces of journalism and heard some very strong interviews, you know, really holding governments and the UK government, for instance, up to account. So I think we're seeing worrying threats to the media and its livelihood, and we have to worry about that. But, you know, I think this is a time for good journalism to show why it's important and why that is important for any democracy to, you know, to defend the right for media freedom to exist, I think.
Absolutely. And when we compiled our first monthly Emergency Powers and Civil Liberties report, it was really interesting the amount to which we really relied on local reporting to find out how each police force is behaving. People, even who have been wrongly convicted, we were able to get justice for some people by exposing these stories, which we initially were finding in local press reports by and large. So it's been a really, really vital resource for us in a way that we haven't relied on local press before. But a way to, as you say, kind of shine a light on and see what's happening at a local level. I completely agree with that. Well, I want to thank you both so much for sharing your views and analysis in this podcast videocast, and also for all of the work that you do. Thanks so much.